Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. I'm Kumar Ramakrishna. I'm Associate Dean for Policy Studies and Head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at RSIS. Welcome to this webinar on understanding incels, angry young men or terrorist movement. From time to time, the Terrorism Center at RSIS here invites international thought leaders to share their insights on the rapidly evolving terrorism threat. So in this respect, one emerging trend in the terrorism threatscape that has puzzled many observers in recent times is the so-called incel or involuntary celibate phenomenon. Although the incel phenomenon does not at first glance seem political, it certainly seems to have potentially far-reaching societal effects, especially in relation to the changing face of terrorism and extremism. So to help us better understand the incel phenomenon, we're very pleased and honored today to have with us Professor Bruce Hoffman and his colleague, Mr. Jacob Ware. Bruce Hoffman is professor at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where he directs the Center for Jewish Civilization. He is also the Shelby Cullum and Catherine W. Davis Visiting Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council for Foreign Relations, and a George H. Gilmer Senior Fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center at the U.S. Military Academy. He has also been the first director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at St. Andrews University, and he has had many other distinguished career appointments. He is also the scholar in residence at the CIA, among other engagements with the US government. So he is an extremely experienced policy analyst and terrorism scholar. Of course, he has written many books. Most well-known, I would say, is the book Inside Terrorism, which many undergraduates and students of terrorism have studied. Bruce will be joined by Mr. Jacob Ware, who has co-authored with him several recent articles on changing trends in terrorism. So Jacob is a research associate for counterterrorism at the Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, I'm going to pass the time over to Bruce. But before that, just a reminder that if you have any questions, please put the questions on the Zoom chat box where I can see them as well as the speakers. So with that, look forward to a good and interesting webinar. Bruce, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kumar, for the very kind and warm welcome to both Jacob and myself. It's a great pleasure after a long time to be again speaking to an audience of the RSIS, which I hold with very deep and profound affection from the time that I was a visiting professor over a decade ago. So I'm delighted to be with you here again this evening. I thought I would cover three areas in the brief time that I have before handing over to my colleague, Jacob Ware. I wanted to first address why we regarded the incel threat as worthy of this examination. Secondly, discuss a little bit the emergence of incels and their violent trajectory, and then talk about incels and terrorism before handing it over to Jacob. Both my remarks and those of Jacob's derive from an article we published in the scholarly journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, which I happen to also be the editor-in-chief of. It was published last March online and is widely available. We had a third co-author, Ezra Shapiro, and this work represents really our collective effort. Let me stress at the outset that both our article and our remarks today do not refer to the entire incel community, which is generally nonviolent, but instead focus on an extreme fringe, which on occasion has used violence. It may help to explain why I was drawn to this subject and in turn enlisted Jacob and Ezra, who both had previously done work on the incel movement. For me personally, for many years, I was deeply skeptical that violent inceldom really had anything at all to deal with terrorism. However, one thing that decades of teaching has taught me is that you learn an enormous amount from your students. And in April 2019, a student enrolled in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, which Jacob and Ezra are both graduates of, gave a fascinating in-class presentation or really policy briefing on the incel movement, which not only piqued my interest, but actually caused me to change my mind and to conclude that this really was a phenomena worth more in-depth investigation and research. And for me personally, as someone who's studied terrorism for many years, the rise of violent incels seemed to me to conform to some key broader patterns that we were seeing in both domestic and international terrorism. So that it wasn't an isolated phenomenon, even though obviously their cause and legitimization and at least I shouldn't say legitimization, rationalization and justification of their violence seemed to be part and parcel of broader trends that we were seeing in terrorism worldwide. First, they involved lone perpetrators, the archetypal lone actors, or more colloquially, lone wolves, or in other words, the perpetrators were part of a movement in vernacular in terrorism that has existed for decades, known as the leaderless resistance phenomena. Second, these individuals had been radicalized or indeed were part of an online community reliant on social media for their connectivity, for their networking, for their connections, to create an echo chamber in many respects that egged one another on. Thirdly, they utilized social media to advertise their attacks ahead of time and issue manifestos explaining them, and sometimes videos as well explaining them. Fourthly, they did not belong to an existing tangible organization, as has historically or traditionally been the case with terrorism. In other words, they were not following the commands or the orders of any readily identifiable leader. They were not themselves part of some command and control apparatus or part of a broader logistical network supporting violence, but operated, as I said, completely independently and seemed to thrive off and depend on the internet and social media in particular for their motivation and animation to engage in violence. Like many lone actors in many countries in recent years, they relied on a variety of readily available, often commercially procurable weapons, in some instances firearms, and unfortunately in countries like the United States, including assault weapons, but also more mundane tools of violence, such as knives, machetes, and what we've seen repeatedly in many countries is vehicular attacks intent on committing homicide, just ordinary automobiles or vans or trucks that were used to plow into pedestrians and kill people. And then finally, as the FBI director, Christopher Wray, recently noted, incels, like many other terrorist phenomena we're seeing, seem to defy the conventional demarcations of domestic and international terrorism. Now, let me emphasize from the start that over the past half dozen or so years, we're talking about slightly more than a dozen incidents. With the latest actually having occurred 2 months ago, a plot that was foiled basically because of the bomber's own ineptitude in Virginia in the United States. Nonetheless, even though we're only talking about a dozen or so incidents, they've claimed the lives of more than 50 persons. And with an average of about 8 fatalities per attack, they have been undeniably and tragically lethal. And as someone like myself intensely interested in debates surrounding the classification of violence as terrorism and how we define incidents of violence and the perpetrators as terrorists or not, I was also drawn to this subject because it raises a number of questions about what we consider terrorism and how terrorism should be defined. So the focus of our research was on the online community of individuals who in essence assail what they believe are the social injustices wrought by what they define as genetic determinism and female preferences that in turn have relegated them to the margins of society, and that therefore they advocate and encourage violence as a form of vengeance, retribution, and indeed is a vehicle for profound societal change, which gets into the elements that encapsulate terrorism. So let me move on now, having introduced the subject, to the emergence of the incels and briefly track their violent trajectory. As many of you I'm sure know, because increasing amounts of material has now been written about incels, it's in fact a contraction of the words involuntary celibate. It was coined by a website that was created in 1993 by an undergraduate, female undergraduate at Canada's Carleton University, where she set up a website that she eponymously titled Alana's Celibacy Project. It was not completely unique. There are many other contemporaneous sites that provided individuals with a public outlet, cathartic means to express their frustration in their romantic or lack of romantic relationships, but even more than that, to provide support and even rehabilitation or comfort to romantically alienated individuals. Moreover, these early sites, again, we're talking about the 1990s, before the turn of the century, readily admitted men as well as women. And an incel at that time was simply a person who hadn't had sex in at least the previous 6 months, despite having tried to do so. However, in the early years of the 21st century, as the internet culture evolved, inceldom developed its own unique mindset and worldview, which incel forums consequently began to reflect. And as these forums became more radical, a militant incel identity began to coalesce in certain circles around, as our research concluded, 3 basic or common characteristics. These were, first, viewing society as a caste system that was determined by sexual attractiveness, and where women made decisions about sexual partners based solely on physical appearance. None of this is terribly surprising, except this was being weaponized as part of, one could argue, a movement designed to achieve societal change. Second, that the status of incels was immutable. In other words, they were condemned to this stature, this caste in life, because of their height, their stature, their ethnicity, their religion, their socioeconomic background. And these were not stereotypically young white males, but often attracted persons of mixed racial heritage, persons of color, and in many instances too, people from Asia and elsewhere in the world. And then third, that incels would be perpetually relegated to this lowly position, to what they saw as this repressed, discriminated against status in life, so long as women had the power to choose their partners. So the difference between, say, these grievances that were articulated in the early 20th century compared to prior ones was a very specific conclusion and belief that it was incumbent upon those embracing the label incel to act. In other words, to seize control of their lives and their destiny, and indeed exact revenge for the dismissive and derogatory way that they felt they were being treated. The foremost exemplar of this new trend was a 22-year-old named Elliot Roger. On March 23, 2014, in what became the first publicized incel attack, Roger stabbed 3 of his roommates to death before embarking on a shooting spree in Isla Vista, California, which is a neighborhood favored by students attending the nearby University of California campus at Santa Barbara. He then went on a vehicular and shooting rampage that claimed 3 more lives. Significantly, Elliot Roger was a person of mixed heritage. His mother was Malaysian and his father was a Caucasian from England. Roger thus became the first self-identified incel to go beyond the violent rhetoric of cyberspace and translate thought into action. In other words, into homicidal violence. Roger explained this in a very turgid and detailed manifesto titled, quote unquote, The Day of Retribution, which was in which he stated his acts were intended both to punish the women who had rejected or spurned him, as well as to deliberately inspire imitation and emulation amongst other frustrated and similarly violently inclined males. He posted numerous misogynistic videos on YouTube. In fact, one of them, the video that he took of himself just before he went on his vehicular killing spree, you can still find on YouTube. It was part of a New York Times story. It's fascinating to watch and extraordinarily chilling. There's a cold-blooded rationality to it that is really very disturbing. But all these postings that he did on social media as well detailed in great length his sense of alienation and his profound hatred and rejection of women. After the shooting and after after the killings, I should say, well, some of them were shootings, some of the more militant and extreme incel forum users began to praise and laud Roger and his attack, and themselves spoke of the need to carry out further attacks. In other words, to emulate exactly what Roger had intended. And such praises we have seen would become prophetic. So let me very briefly move on to discussing incels and terrorism before turning it over to Jacob. Now, admittedly, the incel worldview is not obviously political, but because its core ethos revolve around the subjugation and repression of a group, and because its violence is designed to achieve far-reaching societal effects, the handful of incel attacks arguably conform to an emergent trend in terrorism with a much more salient hate dimension or hate crime dimension than we have seen in the past. As of January 2020, Texas law enforcement assessment notes, and I'm quoting, "What begins as a personal grievance due to perceived rejection by women may morph into allegiance to and attempts to further an incel rebellion." To better assess and understand the motivations and dynamics of this violence, Jacob, Ezra, and I categorized incel violence into 4 different categories that are very important to understanding, at least we believe, this phenomenon. First, there are what we term clear incel-motivated terrorist attacks. In other words, incel terrorism. Second, we move into a somewhat grayer area of attacks with mixed motives that evidence incel ideological influences, but may not have been perpetrated in complete conformity to the incel ideology. Third, it gets even grayer, acts of targeted violence perpetrated by self-professed involuntary celibates, and people, men as I should say, who are familiar with the term and who explain or rationalize their violence because of their sexual frustrations and because of their involuntary celibacy. And then finally, we have what we term post-facto inceldom. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It's in essence where historical incidents of violence, particularly directed against women, that certainly predate Elliot Roger, are ex post facto inducted into the infamy of incel violence and are seen as actually having been manifestations of incel violence, even though they don't conform to the pattern of violence that we're talking about. So let me examine them in order. So first, clear incel motivated terrorist attacks. This is far and away the most important category for our research, since these are, at least in our view, acts of political violence with explicit political and ideological aims committed by males claiming to be part of the incel community via its online presence. In all these cases, the attackers publicly expressed their motivation and were primarily driven by their inceldom. That is, their declared affiliation with and adherence to the incel movement. To date, at least according to our calculations, there have been at least 5 clear incel-motivated terrorist attacks or incidents, 3 of which, in fact, have occurred within the past 6 months. As the first self-identified violent incel, Roger has since come to be regarded by the movement's adherents as its patron saint. Indeed, those words are often used. Extremist incels, for instance, routinely encourage one another to go ER, that is to go Elliot Roger, to emulate precisely the kinds of violence that Elliot Roger engaged in 2014, and follow his murderous precedent by engaging in similar acts of terrorism before taking their own lives. This is an act of the ultimate expression of frustration and hostility that culminates in one's own suicide. The deadliest incel attack to date, inspired by Roger's example, occurred 4 years later in Toronto, Canada. There, a 25-year-old named Alec Manassian drove a rented van through one of the city's busiest streets, Yonge Street, for example, striking pedestrians and ultimately killing 10 persons, 8 of whom were women. As I said, just in recent months, I won't go through all the incidents, but it's worth noting that so thus far this year, there's been a bit of an upsurge. In February, there was a stabbing attack at an erotic massage parlor in Canada, where an individual has not been named because he's a juvenile, a minor under 18 years of age, killed one woman and injured another. Significantly and controversially, the Canadian authorities have decided to charge that individual with a terrorist act. A second incident occurred just this past May when someone named Armando Hernandez killed 3 persons in an attack on a shopping mall in Glendale, Arizona. 2 of the 3 deaths were women. And he was a self-processed incel who deliberately said he was deliberately targeting women because of his rage and frustration with society. And then, as I alluded to a moment ago, just a couple of months ago, an individual, Cole Carini in Virginia, attempted to manufacture an improvised explosive device using TATP, triacetone triperoxide, an improvised explosive material that has figured prominently in suicide attacks for the past 30 years. He accidentally detonated the bomb in his hands and showed up in a hospital. He was arrested, and subsequent investigation showed that he had prepared statements that he was planning to attack a shopping mall to demonstrate his rage and anger at women. So that's in essence the first category that we believe conforms most closely to terrorism. The second category are attacks with mixed motives that evidence incel ideological influences. That is to say, this category embraces attackers who espouse or identify with incel ideology and hence frame their violence in that context. The distinguishing feature, though, of these incidents, however, is that they are not obviously perpetrated expressly for political purposes or even in the furtherance of the incel agenda. Instead, the perpetrator simply refers to or mentions incel ideology in explaining or justifying their violence. And there have been, again, according to our count, about 4 incidents. Most of them, but not all, have involved school shootings at high schools, at a community college. One example, for instance, was amongst the most infamous was the February 2018 shootings at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida by Nicholas Cruz, where 17 persons were killed and 17 others were wounded. Each of the perpetrators, including Cruz, had previously referenced some aspect of inceldom in prior online or offline postings. They expressed an outward fascination with incel ideology, and indeed, in many cases, stated their admiration for Elliot Roger. Significantly, and one reason why we don't categorize them as pure incel terrorism is that these incidents do not appear to have specifically targeted women. Instead, each involved a college or a school, perhaps further indicating the absence of a political motive. Third, there are attacks or targeted violence perpetrated by self-professed involuntary celibates. Here we draw the distinction between incels who subscribe to the ideology and to the political movement of the political dimensions of inceldom, and males who simply identify themselves as involuntary celibate. In this category, we include targeted acts of violence involving murders and assaults perpetrated by persons who may refer to themselves as incels or may be cognizant of the incel ideology, but are not otherwise firmly situated within it. Let me give you one example before moving to conclude. 14 months ago, a 26-year-old male named Alex Stavropoulos stabbed a mother in the neck at a Sudbury, Canada shopping center. He subsequently claimed that he really wanted to harm, to kill the woman's infant daughter, who she was putting into a car seat in the back. Of course, like any mother, she immediately attempted to defend her baby against this assault. But here was someone who had this profound animus and enmity towards all females and sought to play out his violence against this infant and claim that he was an incel, an involuntary celibate, without any clear political element or even hate crime dimension to it, except for they're self-declared members of this community. And then finally, let me briefly describe post-facto inceldom. So in addition to the previous three categories, it's important to note an entirely different one, whereby the incel community retroactively inducts past attackers predating Elliot Roger into a virtual pantheon of incel heroes. So among these is Marc Lupine, a Quebecois anti-feminist who murdered 14 women at a polytechnic in Montreal in December 1989. Someone named George Sodini, who killed 3 women at an LA Fitness Health Club in Pennsylvania. And even Sung-Wei Cho, the shooter at Virginia Tech in April 2007, who killed 32 persons and wounded 17 others. So let me turn it over to Jacob now.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Kumar and Raffaello and Imran and everybody over in Singapore for having us. It's a great honor. I'm going to speak briefly about incels within the context of the far right. But before beginning, I'd like to repeat some of those disclaimers that Bruce made right at the beginning. In extremist movements, there are key and vast differences between the broader community and those few who are actually committing violence. And nothing that we say about the individuals who have committed acts of terrorism in the name of the incel community should necessarily be taken to brush the whole movement. And secondly, many of the ideological trends here that I'll discuss are not uniform. They kind of float in and out of various incel forums, and they're often argued upon within the chat rooms themselves. So with that said, I'm going to talk about 3 themes within incel chat rooms that we think signify a rapprochement with the more traditional far right. And those are anti-feminism, racism, and then anti-Semitism. And I'll then briefly touch on some counterterrorism implications. So firstly, incels broadly despise feminism. They argue that more progressive policies towards gender equality are at the root of many of the world's problems, as well as their own, of course. Part of this anger is the product of individual loneliness, but the more ideological factor is the argument that society has basically become an oppressive matriarchy. Incels largely describe their ideal world as traditional, family-oriented. They are reactionary, and though it's not inherently a far-right worldview, a common refrain yearns for what they call the old days, when men had more control over women, monogamy was the norm, and it was allegedly easier to find a spouse. Now, feminism, they argue, has robbed incels of the right to a wife and sex, which some incels then seek to address through violence. Consequently, feminist literature and scholarship has actually led the charge in studying incels, and understanding the role that male sexual frustration and so-called aggrieved entitlement can play in political and public violence, as well as the role that gendered narratives play in radicalization, are really essential to understanding incel ideology and the violent fringe. Moving forward, whether or not they're specifically intrinsic to incel ideology, racial themes are functionally inextricable from the incel narrative. Elliot Roger, who Bruce discussed, published a manifesto that was a thoroughly racist document. At one point, Roger bemoans an African-American friend's sexual experiences by comparing himself to British aristocracy and the acquaintance to slaves. Similar racist discourse with no direct connection to incel ideology also appears prominently on forums where different races are ranked for their chances with women and for the hopelessness of their respective futures. And also in an age-old white supremacist slur, interracial couples are particularly despised. The white girls portrayed as driven only by thoughtless sexual desire, and the non-white men portrayed as driven by criminal bestial lust. Finally, many incels also rail against Jews. And again, though it's not necessarily part and parcel of the cultural narrative, the classic anti-Semitic refrain about Jews controlling society, whether through government or banks or the media, is relatively common among incels when identifying the causes of social decay and their own degeneration. In fact, several of the perpetrators of incel-related violence that Bruce discussed also professed vehemently anti-Semitic views. Scott Bailey, who opened fire at a Tallahassee yoga studio, was called Nazi Scott by an old social group, while Nicholas Cruz, the perpetrator of that Parkland shooting, because into his gun magazines that he used on the day of his massacre. To illustrate the point, in Europe, several far-right attackers have also displayed incel tendencies, whether in public statements or in their online profiles. To give one example, the perpetrator of an October 2019 shooting at a synagogue and kebab shop in Halle in Germany confessed to his crimes by claiming that immigrants had stopped him from getting a girlfriend. He also described himself as a loser and a disgruntled white man, and he cited feminism as, quote, the cause of declining birth rates in the West, end quote. And these are all typical themes in the incel mindset and ideology. Several European far-right terrorists' repetition of common incel refrains, while not necessarily indicative of their own membership in that community, points to an increasing convergence between the radical right and incel communities, particularly online, as well as the enduring role that sexual frustration and loneliness can play in sparking political violence of all ideological stripes. So why does this happen? Why the rapprochement? Bruce and I have argued that over the past several years, far-right online communities have noticed the incel rhetoric's racial and men's rights undertones and have thereby sought to deepen ties between these two movements. Opposition to feminism, the most fundamental shared belief between these two extremisms, is often described as the gateway from incel ideology to more recognized far-right ideology. Basically, the argument goes, once you accept that you are oppressed by women in a society that rejects you, it becomes far easier to claim that you are also oppressed by other races and that society rejects you because of some Jewish or leftist plot to suppress white men. Social media and online communities are particularly dangerous because they can seduce and individuals who do not initially share that ideology. Social media and the algorithms embedded on social media sites can drag vulnerable individuals into internet rabbit holes where they become exposed to increasingly radical material and extremist interpretations. And there they often develop double lives, unbeknownst to friends and family. In a March 2020 survey of the Incels.co forum site, over 50% of respondents claimed that nobody in the real world knew they were incels. Many incels cite loneliness and rejection as a motivating factor for first exploring the forums, but loneliness isn't necessarily a precursor for extremism. Social media algorithms can inadvertently guide such users into increasingly extremist communities, in turn fueling radicalization and weaponizing an individual's simple search for belonging. Incels and far-right adherents now regularly and openly intermingle on sites including Reddit and 8kun. Alec Manassi, the Toronto attacker who Bruce discussed, posted a pre-attack message on an alt-right 4chan image board. I think the ongoing rapprochement is important for two reasons. Firstly, both incel and far-right violence, as we know, has manifested itself primarily in lone actor attacks, from Isla Vista, California to Christchurch, New Zealand. So as you increase the number of possible adherents, you also increase the likelihood of individuals committing attacks in the name of either ideology. Secondly, and much more positively, as the extremisms come together, single counterterrorism policies become increasingly likely to successfully blanket both. So any new policies to counter either violent incel or far-right terrorism should have both extremisms in mind. In our recent paper in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, co-author Ezra lay out several possible counter-terrorism responses. And I'd like to focus here on two: countering violent extremism programming and social media regulation. Firstly, any successful strategy to counter the potential of increased incel terrorism will require devoting more energy and resources to community initiatives designed to counter violent extremism, what we would call in counterterrorism CVE. The incel movement is particularly dangerous because of its accessibility. Incel radicalization takes genuine pain and honest loneliness and converts it into hatred, anger, and in rare cases, violence. Learning how to better intercept incel radicalization while individuals are still in that pain and loneliness stage is therefore an urgent imperative. Alana, whose online forums introduced the involuntary celibate concept, recently founded called Love Anger, an organization dedicated to pushing back against incel hatred by addressing the abject loneliness evident across these online forums. Supporting, encouraging, and replicating these and other such initiatives will therefore be central to any effective countermeasures. To be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with a community of young people who have trouble finding love and relationships forming online support groups. But the ongoing vilification of a targeted outgroup with extreme rhetoric and violent suppression presents a grave danger. It harnesses real sadness and frustration, turns it into hatred, and focuses it in harmful directions. The best way to prevent incel terrorism accordingly is to undermine incel ideology in the first place through rehabilitation and insulation from new extremism. Sadly, this must include dramatically improving access to mental health resources for young people online to break down stigmas inhibiting such intervention. Illnesses such as depression and anxiety run deep in the incel community, according to surveys of people populating these online sites. In the March survey I mentioned earlier, almost 70% of respondents claimed to suffer from depression, while almost 30% claimed to be autistic. These mental health issues also surface in the suicidal rhetoric that runs rampant on these forums. Mitigating this proclivity to despair and suicide and protecting vulnerable young people online could blunt what could otherwise become a self-fulfilling pathway to violence. Secondly, both governments and technology companies who provide these digital platforms must also collaborate both more and better to counter the spread of violent online extremist ideologies. Although specific incel forums themselves are actually relatively well policed, self-policed, posts on more eclectic sites, including 8kun and 4chan, continue to call for violence against women and minorities, as well as provide a location where extremist manifestos can be posted before acts of terrorism. Recent international efforts to counter online extremism include the April 2019 UK government's online harms white paper, meant to more effectively tackle threatening online content. In June 2019, in the wake of a devastating far-right attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern instigated the Christchurch Call, an international political summit to address online extremism and the role of social media companies in its propagation. The ensuing document has been signed by upwards of 50 countries. In the US, stringent free speech laws make passing legislation to tackle online extremism more difficult, but alternative measures to undermine the free online have been suggested by journalists, scholars, CVE practitioners, and politicians alike. For now, a broader conversation is needed on how to push back against extremism and violent ideologies online, involving tech companies, terrorism and radicalization experts, governments, and even former extremists and young social media users. More effectively addressing the role of the internet in empowering incel mobilization is a critical priority. And as we've shown, challenging the incels' online sanctuary would concurrently degrade far-right ideologies and their spread online as well. I'll turn it back there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce and Jacob, for that extremely stimulating interventions. We have a bunch of questions now, but perhaps I'll get the ball rolling by asking for your assessment of this particular position. I mean, when we talk about, of course, there's no widely recognized understanding or definition of terrorism, but generally there is this conventional understanding that terrorism usually involves the use of force or threat of force to pursue certain political objectives. The incel phenomenon seems, or the movement, seems to be rather idiosyncratic than political in their motivations. So is there, from a policy perspective, a potential pitfall that we include the incel phenomenon within the understanding of terrorism? It might actually do more harm than good in terms of the analysis aspect, or do you think that this should be considered as part of the extremism and terrorism landscape? Just to get the ball rolling.
Sure. Well, let me start, and then I know Jacob has his own thoughts about this as well. There's Kumar, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a danger if we call everything terrorism, nothing's going to be terrorism at the end of the day, and terrorism becomes something that you either disagree with or dislike intensely, or indeed go hearkening back to its original and roots, that it's inspire fear and anxiety. Like things that are such as are happening in Portland in the United States now are undoubtedly illegal, involve acts of violence, I mean, arson, vandalism, but does that rise to a level of terrorism? I think is debatable. In the context of the incels, I mean, we admit it's debatable. That's one reason that we broke it out into 4 categories, that not all acts are or should be viewed as terrorism. Again, someone in one instance that stomped to death, tragically, a homeless man, and then said he did it because he's sexually frustrated. I mean, that was a form of involuntary celibacy. We wouldn't categorize that. But at the same time, we felt we couldn't ignore people like Elliot Roger or Scott Bailey or Alec Manassian, who clearly were framing their violence as terrorists do to attract attention to themselves and their causes, because of this campaign to relegate women back to a much more historically genderized position, as Jacob described, to roll back the clock and end feminism, which was to have a profound impact on society, and to do that through fear and intimidation. So, we admit that, these aren't pure and clear categories, but I would argue that this is happening across the board in terrorism. I mean, we see fewer and fewer actual terrorist organizations and more collections of individuals who have gathered on social media, in cyberspace, who have perpetuated this endless echo chamber to serially motivate, inspire them to go out and undertake acts of violence. So in that sense, I think it is still arguable. I mean, one of our motivations too, I should have pointed out at the beginning, is, to our knowledge right now, there are many others in the pipeline. There was only one other scholarly article that actually dissected this, that had been published a year ago in Terrorism and Political Violence, another excellent terrorism journal. And we just thought it was very important to further this debate. In fact, we have a new article in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism by Simon Cote coming out that actually disagrees with the article that Jacob and I and Ezra wrote. And that's fine. We thought, exactly as your question suggests, that this is something that we have to debate and discuss, and that there may not be any clear or hard and fast answers, but at the same time, we shouldn't deny that there might not be a terrorist element in this that we need to pay attention to, especially because of the emulation and imitation dimension.
Sure. Jacob, would you like to?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I would just add, I would just, emphasize what Bruce said about, I think one of the frustrations that I always had when looking at incels was there was never any discussion of, we kind of put all the attacks together in the same bucket, and there was always this number people used, 50, and they spoke about Elliot Roger and Alec Manassian and Nicholas Cruz, and it all totaled up to 50. There's a lot of differences in those attacks, in the ideology, in the motivations. I think one of the questions that is always useful to ask when you look at terrorism is a targeting question. What are they actually targeted at? And when you look at the targets that incel terrorists, as Bruce and I describe them, have targeted, you look at sorority houses, you look at yoga studios, you look at couples. The recent attack that Bruce described in Arizona, he wanted to kill 10 victims because he wanted to kill 5 full couples. So there is an active extremist ideological threat targeted at romantically successful people and against women. And it's an ideological threat. It might not be political. And it's a good point that incels disagree deeply on political solutions. There's no real policy. Some say that they want, government-funded sex programs. Some say there's no point because the incels are already too far gone. There's nothing you can do. But there's no real political kind of aim that they're going for. But there is an active ideological strand, and there's an active ideological extremist threat against certain communities, especially in the US and Canada, that I think therefore makes it easier to think through a terrorism lens.
Thanks very much. One of the questions that has emerged from the audience is this question of to what extent would you say that the incels have similarities to other movements like QAnon, and I remember one of the articles both yourself, Jacob, and Bruce wrote we're talking about the mixing of ideologies, right? And you know, there's this shading perhaps into the not just within the white supremacist movement, but also even elements of the Islamists, right? There was this very strange mixing. So is that something we should be looking out for, this mixing of ideological ideas and incels with the wider white supremacists, as you mentioned, or even beyond that? I mean, is there something to look for? I mean, to look out for?
Jacob, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Yes, I think this is a major trend we're seeing right now in terrorism, specifically in the West. I think the great kind of case study for it is Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, who obviously penned an extremely racist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist document, but called himself an eco-fascist because he had concerns over the environment, which is a left-wing concern. This is somebody that kind of had invented his own ideology in his mind within the white supremacist kind of umbrella. We're seeing this with incels as well. Elliot Roger, for example, no real reason to be a white supremacist in his documents, but clearly had read that online and had involved that into his own kind of mindset and ideology. And as I mentioned, I think the issue with this is that you broaden the number of adherents. If you've got people who are going online, they're having a tough time with love and sex as high school students, and they fall into an extremist movement because there's recruiters on those sites. I have recently, a month or so ago, I was on incels.co forum, and just on a regular thread, and somebody started posting about Zionist occupied government, which is an age-old white supremacist conspiracy theory in the United States. And somebody responds to them saying, what is Zionist occupied government? And I just thought that moment right there was a moment in that person's life where they were going to diverge either towards the far right or stay with this, ideology that they had that was coming from pain and coming from loneliness. And I think that kind of shows what the problem is that we're dealing with, because there are people who are going to incel movements because they're sad, because they lack father figures, because they are having a tough time at school, they're being bullied, they might have mental health issues, and they're turning into they're kind of stumbling upon radicalizers on those forums who are vicious people who hold truly white supremacist neo-Nazi views and are long-standing in those views. And that kind of turns the threat from a relatively small thing that comes from kind of personal grievances into obviously a much bigger issue and a much bigger trend that we're seeing across the Western world right now.
Yeah, I'd say one thing, and this is what attracted me to the subject. It wasn't so much the incels per se, it was that it just fit into these broader patterns of terrorism, Kumar. And that question about ideological convergence, I think, is enormously significant. I mean, what we're finding, and I'm going to move away a little bit from the incel exemplar. I mean, what we're finding, for instance, is white nationalists and white power and white supremacists making common cause or attempting to make common cause with Salafi jihadis, for example. You have, for instance, a very recent far-right, very dangerous far-right group with an American citizen based in St. Petersburg, Russia, calling the group the base, obviously in homage to Al-Qaeda. So this, to me, is another interesting trend in terrorism, as Jacob described, where we see some aspects of inceldom mixing with white supremacism. You could also say that some of their ethos, the anti-feminism, was one of ISIS's focuses as well. So we're seeing now groups that in the past may have had one clear, very strict or specific ideology, taking on board other ones as well, which is going to complicate, I think, how we respond to terrorism.
Right. Thanks very much. Another question here on the floor relates to what are the social media platforms which the incels tend to make use of, and which we should be aware of, and how have they responded to deplatforming in the past? Example, Reddit removal. Right. So what are the main platforms? They tend to use.
This is precisely why I enlisted two young people co-authors with me, because this is completely outside of my depth. So I'm going to turn it over to Jacob.
Cool. So I think there's kind of two different areas. The first is the ones that I've spent more time on, which are websites like Incels.co, sites belonging to incels, run by incels, and that's kind of the only discussion that happens there. So they are committed incel websites. In my experience, those tend to be kind of less vicious, and I'm not sure we've seen any actual people, terrorists, come off those platforms. The ones that are more vicious are the ones that intermingle with the more radical right. So for example, 4chan, 8chan before it was shut down, 8kun, Reddit. Those are where the individuals that we've seen commit attacks, for example, Elliot Roger, Alec Manassian, Nicholas Cruz, I think those would come off those kinds of sites. Less self-policing, more eclectic ideologies, more diverse ideologies. Reddit has shut down recently a few incel sites that were becoming, increasingly vicious. 8chan's been taken down recently, been relaunched. So there has been deplatforming, but my understanding is that incels are continuing to thrive on those platforms, intermingling, as I said, with the far right adherents on those. The incels.co, for example, tend to be pretty well self-policed. Like I said, you rarely see violent posts on those. When I mean, less vicious, I mean actively violent, calling for violence. The ideologies are as violent, are as vicious on all of them, but the violent posts, the ones calling for violence, the ones targeting people, the ones making actionable threats tend to be on websites like Reddit, 8kun, 4chan. And those are, but some of them have been taken down and some of them refuse to be taken down. Telegram is another one, obviously, that we deal with across all ideologies.
One of the questions which arises from the discussion is, which was actually mentioned earlier, to what extent should we treat this incel phenomenon as a mental health issue rather than, channeling some things which I think some observers may suggest. If you securitize it, right, that may add in a few more layers of complication, but if you treat it as a serious mental health issue and devote resources in that direction, do you think that is a good way to go, or it's not enough, or what do you think?
I think it's one of many tools that can be applied, and I think it's the same with the far right. We had a recent attack in Germany in Hanau with an individual who'd written a manifesto that was wildly bizarre. He was talking about how football coaches had stolen his tactical ideas. And this was an individual who therefore felt he was going to attack refugees at 2 hookah bars. Obviously, that person needed some mental health intervention at some point, needed to be stopped from buying a firearm, especially. And incels specifically, all the attackers we've seen pretty much have been diagnosed with mental health issues. Elliot Roger had, I think, Asperger's, same with Alec Manassian. Nicholas Cruz had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So I personally think this is one of the most difficult things to talk about when you talk about incels and far right, because you're ultimately talking about people who are suffering and who've been given an opportunity to radicalize and who we lost because they needed help. So I think this is one of the many tools that we need to be thinking about. That in the incel case as well, kind of broader anti-bullying initiatives to protect young people who are really, really suffering from loneliness and bullying in schools, because a lot of the time those kinds of kids are turning online to look for answers, to look for belonging, to look for father figures who can give answers to their problems in the world, and because they're not finding them in the real world, so they're finding them online from people who don't have good intentions, and that's obviously a problem and a great failure of counterterrorism and of our societies.
I don't know whether Bruce, would you want to add anything there?
Well, this is such an important issue because, terrorism and mental health aren't mutually inclusive or exclusive. And I think terrorism never occurs in a vacuum. Always is situated within society where there are people who are high functioning, but nonetheless have profound mental disorders. And they're terrorists that in both senses either. I remember 40 plus years ago when I first started studying terrorism, there was a certain sentiment that all terrorists were mentally ill, and that's since being disproven, but that's not to say that none of them are. I think the question is whether we treat this as a mental illness or a mental health issue, or or a securitized one, you have to do both. Because it's not just lone idiosyncratic individuals. They are attempting to give a collective voice and meaning to their violence, to egg one another on, to, as I said earlier, to inspire, motivate, and animate them to commit violence. And in that sense, it does become a security issue. And it may not, law enforcement and intelligence may not be the be-all and end-all answer to countering it, but it can't be ignored either.
Well, so that's makes complete sense. Thanks, Bruce. There's a question here. It's very interesting. From Huda. I mean, you would know Huda, right? And he says, thanks for bringing the notion of masculinity as one of the important factors of radicalization. And it's interesting, he's asking, do you see any tendency of a similar condition of being hopelessly romantic man amongst Islamists, right? Who can't get married, and this may be a driver in provoking them to violence. And in fact, sexual repression on the Islamist side. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's a great pleasure to hear from Huda, who's become an expert in this field as well. So it's also a great honor to hear from him. Well, of course, I'm surprised he didn't mention Muhammad Atta as well. I mean, this was something around the time of the 9/11 hijackings that was discussed in great detail. And anyone who knows of Sayyid Qutb in particular, on his sojourn to the United States and his repulsion at Western licentiousness and values that gave rise to his ideology, as articulated in Milestones and elsewhere. I mean, there's something to it, but I think, even as I said earlier, as ISIS might have in common with incels or even with white power or white nationalists, this stark and profound anti-feminist streak to them, that's front and center for incels. It's a part and parcel of these other groups, but it's not the core of the ideology that gives rise to ISIS or to radical Salafi jihadists, for example. It may be an element and it may be an explanation, but how we privilege it or how important it is, I think is not as salient as it is with incels, where it is front and center and is exactly what they embrace.
Sure. Jacob, you want to add anything here?
That's a question for Bruce for sure.
There's an interesting question from the floor. Angry young women someday as a reaction to oppose the male-dominated incel movement. You see any indications of that arising in reaction, perhaps like a co-radicalization phenomenon? Interesting.
Well, this is always an interesting phenomenon in terrorism, that the Chechen Black Widows was seen as a completely new phenomenon, and now the hostile ISIS wives that are in Al-Hol and other camps. But of course, women in terrorism have a long involvement. The Russian revolutionaries, the People's Will and the People's Way, certainly in many radical left-wing organizations of the 1960s and 70s and 80s that engaged in terrorism. Tamil Tigers in South Asia, of course, is key part. So we shouldn't neglect the idea that women have had a role in this kind of violence. I mean, I hope that's not going to be the case, because when you think about it, you look at all the mass shootings, for instance, in the United States and elsewhere, Breivik, Brenton Tarrant, who Jacob talked about. We're all talking about angry males, basically, that and I'm not saying any of them are incels either, but I'm just saying that we're talking about a phenomenon of violence these days that's perpetrated by males, and fortunately not women. I think one would really despair if we find that both genders, share this just profound animus and hatred of society. And, that polarization could well occur. But the point is, when Alana formed that website in 1993, it had nothing to do with violence and was everything about assuaging people's sadness and sorrow and their frustrations. And it really is very sad how it has been, firstly, hijacked and overwhelmed and dominated by men who stormed onto those internet forums, and then not only dominated it and sort of, acquired it for themselves, but then introduced a very strident, violent dimension to it that first didn't talk about homicide. It was about rape, and it was about almost studying criminal justice procedures. For instance, the textbooks that are used in law enforcement and criminal justice courses to investigate rapes. And you had these individuals reverse engineering that information to, in other words, to commit rape and then get away with it, not be prosecuted. And then that led to still worse violence. So I'd say, fortunately, it remains a male phenomenon. It would be unusual, I think, to see women turning to violence in this way.
Sure. Perhaps to wrap things up, there are a couple of questions on the impact of COVID-19 on people having to be all cooped up and isolated, and having nothing to do much except go online. Do you see that this could be have an impact on getting more people, more young males interested in the incel movement? And what do you think?
Well, let me say something quickly and then give Jacob the last word. I think in any assessment of terrorism today, we still don't fully understand the impact and the role of social media and the ubiquity of communications, of the endless echo chamber that is being created, so that all our assumptions about terrorism, I think, are really challenged by what we see as this latest revolution in communications and indeed in networking. More specifically, I mean, just as a superficial response, I mean, it's fascinating to me that when we published this paper, there were only 3 incidents in that first category of incel terrorism. 5 or 4 months later, since we've published it, there are now 6. It's almost doubled. We've seen in the United States in particular, for example, how COVID-19 has weaponized anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, hatred and persecution or harassment of Asians and Asian Americans, whether they're Chinese or not, inevitably anti-Semitism and targeting of Jews, of Latinos as well, of African, I mean, almost everyone has been swept into the COVID-19. And I think that point is a very germane one. When people are cooped up inside, when they're frustrated, when they're restless, I mean, and when they spend a lot of time online, perhaps not as productively as all of us do in the academy, let's say on Zoom meetings and Zoom lectures, but unless when they're online all the time, you can see, I think, the dangers of this. We've already had incidents in the United States where individuals have been inspired and animated by social media to attack a hospital in Kansas City that was treating COVID patients, which they said was a joke, to attack a Jewish assisted living home in Massachusetts, for example, to attack a hospital ship in Long Beach. So we see that as the leading terrorism scholar of communications, Gabby Vyman, has said that, words have meaning and can be easily translated into violence. And we are seeing it, unfortunately, in the COVID pandemic.
Sure. Jacob?
Yeah, just a couple of points just quickly. I think here in the States, it's not just the coronavirus. We've also had rolling protests here in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've got, unprecedented numbers of young people at home spending unprecedented amounts of time online with unprecedented questions about the world. And some of them don't have people to answer them in the real world. So we're going to have some serious problems across all ideologies, I think, with radicalization over the next few months and years. And that remains to be seen. And the incels will be included in that. I have spent a little bit of time just briefly looking into, what incels are saying about COVID. Mostly it seems to be, a celebration of normal, basically what they called normies. So normal, sexually, active people dying. I think that's a celebration in among incels. They're also celebrating the fact that couples can't get together because of social distancing rules. So they're celebrating the fact that, basically saying, well, I might not be having sex, but nobody else is. So there's kind of an interesting point they've come to there. At the same time, well, I'll add also that incels, I'm not sure if he's touched on this, but incels tend to be nihilists. They tend to believe that there's no point anymore in their lives, and that's why we see such high rates of suicide. There's a common argument that, they call it the black pill. Basically, not only is this the reality that we face, but we can never change it, so there's no point. So they don't look at COVID as something that's devastating to them. They kind of see it as well. It's just something that hopefully accelerates our way towards dying. At the same time, that attack that we saw in May in Arizona, in Glendale, where an individual was targeting couples, it's tough to believe that wasn't accelerated slightly by him staying at home and building up frustration and not having any kind of social interaction, and just being radicalized further by things he was reading online. So I think that answer will play out over the next months and years. There's no answer right now, but I don't think it looks good across any ideology for counter-radicalization right now.
Okay, right. I'm very conscious that it's at night, about 10 p.m. Where you are. So it's not very far from bedtime. So just want to thank you again, Bruce and Jacob, for taking time out from your evenings to sort of join us and share to share some of your insights on this emerging phenomenon of the incel movement and the relation to other forms of extremism. So with that, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope you found this as interesting as I did, and I hope to see you again at the next RSIS ICPVTR webinar. So with that, thank you, and have a nice day for us here, and a good evening to speakers. So thanks very much.